What is up, everyone, and welcome to a special episode of The Danny Show, or should I say, Dan is Jericho, because today is the day of the Avatola of Rock and Rolla, the greatest Intercontinental Champion next to Gunter, and one of the greatest of AEW today, the leader of Fozzy. Today is the day, bottom line, of Chris Jericho. And for the first time in 2 years, I am back, this time with part two of my top 10 favorite matches from Chris Jericho. Let's get started with this list. We start at number 10 with we start at number 10 with a bang because we start with Stone Cold Steve Austin from No Way Out 2002. This was a good match, really good match to watch as Chris Jericho defended his undisputed championship against one of the guys he defeated in the same night back at Vengeance 2001, which is also on my other list. But this match with unexpected assists was won by Chris Jericho due to outside interference on the newly arriving poison of WWE, the NWO, consisting of Hogan, Nash, and the late great Scott Hall. This match would help Chris Jericho win and retain. Next at number 9, we have Chris Jericho versus Dolph Ziggler at SummerSlam 2012. This was built as the future versus the veteran. Chris Jericho being the veteran of wrestling and Dolph Ziggler being the uprising star. And even though he had been in WWE for 7 years, partly with the Spirit Squad, this match right here was built as Dolph Ziggler's persona, which had been around for 3 years. Now, in this match, Chris Jericho fought with injured ribs and would end up doing a hurricanrana onto Dolph Ziggler from the top rope, which is not a good idea when you have bad ribs, but Chris Jericho can do it. And not only did he do that, but he managed to win the match. And after the match, Dolph Ziggler felt like it should have been him. Next on this list at number 8, we have Chris Jericho under the Lionheart persona versus Bryan Danielson at AEW All Out last year. And it was a great technical match, both men pulling out their best submission holds and other great moves. Unfortunately for Chris Jericho, being the heel that he was at the time, he decided to end a great match under dirty tactics with the low blow and the Judas effect. Next on this list at number 7, we have Chris Jericho versus Claudio, aka Cesaro, on an AEW Dynamite episode of Grand Slam, which took place on September the 21st, 2022 of last year. This is Chris Jericho challenging Claudio for the Ring of Honor Championship, and it was a match that we saw Chris Jericho take 18 laps of the Swiss swing. Unfortunately, Chris Jericho, being the heel at the time, was not a man of honor and decided to win this match using the low blow and the Judas effect to win the match. And like the commentator said, one of the Ring of Honor commentators was very devastated because of the fact that it was not an honorable win, and it was a match basically full of dishonor. But the fans were pretty happy about it, and some of the fans were happy that he won, despite the fact that he was a villain. Next at number 7, this was an honorable loss for Chris Jericho that took place at Payback 2013 against CM Punk, the returning CM Punk, rather, as he fought a heck of a match against CM Punk as build up to who truly was the best in the world. Chris Jericho being the best in the world at what he does, while CM Punk is just the best in the world. This would prove to be one of the best matches in the world, as CM Punk would go face to face with Jericho in a almost 5-star classic. Paul Heyman was so worried whether or not Punk would win that he stood on the apron watching the show, watching the match. He was that worried. Nonetheless, it was CM Punk that would win the match in his hometown of Chicago. Which reminds me, do you think CM Punk will return for this year's Survivor Series taking place in Chicago? Let me know your thoughts in the comment. Nonetheless, Chris Jericho had a very honorable loss in a match against CM Punk, which was nearly 5 stars. Completely awesome. Next on this list, we have at number 5, we have CM Punk versus Adam Page at AEW All Out 2019. This was a match in which Chris Jericho would defend his AEW World Championship. And Adam Page had a great showing. We saw Adam Page go for a running shooting star off the apron, a moonsault, and 2 buckshot lariats. Nonetheless, that was not enough to keep Chris Jericho down. Chris Jericho would go for the code breaker at time, walls of Jericho, but that wasn't enough. But the Judas effect did the job. And even though Chris Jericho was a heel, Chris Jericho won the match in an honorable fashion without help, which is more than I can say about Roman Reigns. At number 4, let's go to WCW. We have Chris Jericho versus Ultimo Dragon at Bash of the Beach 1997. In a time where the NWO was breaking traditions and breaking honorable traditions, Chris Jericho and Ultimo Dragon had a very traditional lucha-like match and was very honorable. Chris Jericho, being the WCW Cruiserweight Champion, I believe, would face off against Ultimo Dragon in an Ultimate Classic, which they would pull out their best moves. We saw Ultimo Dragon do something Rey Mysterio like with the 619 spin through the ropes like move. Nonetheless, with a roll-up, Chris Jericho would win this great match and shake hands with Ultimo Dragon. One of the traditional things left of WCW at that time, with NWO coming in and breaking tradition. Next, at number 3, we have Chris Jericho defending his undisputed WWE Championship against The Rock at Royal Rumble 2002 in Atlanta. Now, Theory's hometown, but my former hometown as well. This match was a rematch because of what happened in December with Chris Jericho winning, even though crooked fashion. Chris Jericho would have a rematch against The Rock. Chris Jericho would survive taking a rock bottom through the Spanish announce table, because it always happens to the Spanish announce table. Then we would see Chris Jericho, like Roman Reigns, get help from people such as Christian Cage, who before he liked talking about people's dads, and Lance Storm. But if I can be serious for a moment, with all of that happening, The Rock still came back. But this time, it was an exposed turnbuckle post and a roll-up, one of the most popular ways to win a match in this day, for the win. Next at number 2, we have Chris Jericho versus Eddie Kingston at AEW Revolution. This was a match that was a great match, but it was a losing end. Both men traded chops like Walter, aka Gunter. I don't know, to be honest, even though they traded shots with one another, I don't know if they would be able to trade shots with Gunter. Just saying. But nonetheless, they traded chops with one another. They fought in a great match. The match was won by submission on Eddie Kingston's end. Chris Jericho, not happy with the loss, did not want to shake Eddie Kingston's hand. Nonetheless, this was a great match on both ends, and Chris Jericho would win a rematch against Eddie Kingston in a match that saw the ring surrounded by barbed wire. What is the number one match on this list? We have Chris Jericho with Christopher. I'm just going to say Christopher. Chris Jericho versus with Christopher versus the two-man power trip of Triple H and Stone Cold Steve Austin. This tag team match took place on an episode of Monday Night Raw during the Attitude Era on May the 21st of 2001. This would be a match where we would see Chris Jericho and Christopher, as I will name him due to certain circumstances. But Chris Jericho and Christopher would win the tag team titles off of what was then known as the two-man power trip due to two things happening. As great as the tag team match was, this was unfortunately for Triple H the match where we would see him in action for 8 months until January of 2002. Because as Chris Jericho was in the walls of Jericho with Stone Cold, Triple H broke the hole and tore one of his muscles, quadricep muscles. And Chris Jericho would go for the walls of Jericho on the outside. Stone Cold would stop it. Then Christopher would fight with Stone Cold. We would see Christopher also fight off Triple H. And let's give credit to Triple H, because after Triple H had tore his muscle, he came back with a sledgehammer to attempt to break up the crossface that was being applied by Christopher to Stone Cold. Triple H would break the hole, and then Christopher would fight him off, leaving Chris Jericho, the man of this day, to pin Stone Cold Steve Austin and win the tag team championships in Raw's main event. So, that is my top 10 favorites, part 2. Let me know in the comment section, what was your favorite Chris Jericho match? I'm your host, Daniel Cody, and that's all the time I have for you today. And I'll be back with another review on all things wrestling. See you later, folks.